So thank you very much for that. I also ought to thank Robin for the invitation that he kindly extended to my boss, and hence the reason I'm here. I was asked this afternoon to give a brief talk on sort of practical examples of what's happening in the food industry in relation to sustainability. And so what I thought I would do is simply just take the example of AB Sugar, some of the work that I think we're doing that fits the mold quite nicely, and then open it up to discussion at the end, and you can tell me how near or far off the mark I am. Firstly then, to put this talk into context, ABF is a fairly large global sugar group, 11.1 billion turnover at last count, and about 102,000 employees across the world, operating in 46 countries. It has 5 major divisions, the first being sugar, which is about a third of the group by turnover and profit. Primark, that will be known to some of you as our retail division, thankfully not me, I don't generally choose to go in it if I can avoid it, but it is a super low-priced retail operation, which is also part of ABF. And then the 3 other divisions, grocery, ingredients and agriculture, make up the final third. And some of the brands that you see under those would be recognisable to you, namely Twinings, Jordan's Ryvita, to name but a few. So that's the group in a nutshell. Corporate objectives, they're clearly commercial. So ABF's corporate objectives are, number 1, to make real profit growth year on year, and to deliver long-term cash returns to the shareholders. Interestingly, our shareholders are dominated by the Western family, so we do generally take a longer-term view of our investments, and you'll see in some of the things, therefore, as a consequence of that we've done in the sugar industry, are exemplars of a much longer-term, much more pragmatic view on investment to deliver the characteristics of a business that we can sustain in the longer term. We focus on market segments that we can establish long, strong and sustainable positions, so we like to be market leaders where we operate, and we will grow both organically and by acquisition. And there have been a number of examples in the growth of sugar in the last 7 years where we've grown substantially by acquisition. Focus on achieving high levels of operational efficiency, and focus on delivering business through that devolved structure that I talked about earlier. The 5 key divisions operate very autonomously. So there's a lot of challenge from group, but essentially, when it comes to sugar, for example, I run the show. What does corporate responsibility mean to us? Well, it's about a culture that's really built around a long-term perspective for the business, and at the same time enhancing the quality of the community, of the lives of people in the communities in which we operate, and also those of our employees. So I think there's quite a nice fit with the discussion that we're having today. Commitment to sustainability manifests itself in the form of clearly the environmental impact, clearly the impact we have on people, fostering ethical business relationships in all our business streams, and being good neighbours, thereby being welcomed in the communities in which we're operating, many of which we recognise to our hosts, we are but guests, and we don't take that privilege lightly. Final slide on context, AB Sugar. So the group operates in 3 key regions, Sub-Saharan Africa, 6 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Ilovo at the bottom. We operate in North and South China, 12 mills, 5 cane mills in the south, 7 sugar beet mills in the north, and then we operate in the UK. I heard mention of Tate & Lyle earlier, that's the competition, thank you. But British Sugar actually trades through Silver Spoon in retail sugar and is about 65% market share in the retail sector. So you might be familiar with the Tate & Lyle name, but actually we're stronger in retail. And then Azucarera in Spain, which is the Spanish leading sugar company that we acquired some 4 years ago. So that's us. Financial numbers are there unashamedly because we are about growing and we are about developing our business model to generate superior financial returns. And that's what underpins what we believe that we are aspiring to be, which is the world's leading sugar business. So enough about that. What I wanted to do now was focus in on the specifics. So for those of you that live near Downham Market, this is the Wissington factory. It's the biggest beet sugar factory in the world, and it is increasingly, for me, a complex biorefinery. So it isn't simply making sugar, it's making a whole host of other products. And it's that I really want to focus in on today, because I think it's that actually brings sustainability to life in a very practical way, and in a way which complements the commercial objectives of the business. So that might not look pretty to some of you. It actually looks very special to me. Just if you take down the bottom here, this is a site of special scientific interest. There are wildflower plains just there, and in fact the water that feeds those plains is coming out of the factory, not water we draw on to go into the factory. And that's just one practical example before we go off the picture as to what matters to us in the environment in which we operate. To get this more straightforward, I thought we'd just build up the model of what making sugar is all about, and then I'll build off that to get into sustainability examples more strongly, because I think that's where it really does, as I say, come to life. We take sugar beet in, very simply, we shred it up, we put it through a hot water diffuser, we then basically clarify the juice that's now the soup, if you like, with the sugar in it, and then we evaporate all the water. We then take the concentrated juice and crystallize it to make white sugar. Very, very simple. I'm not a scientist, by the way, so I'll keep it simple. One of the important features in that is clearly this piece over here, which is the energy source that we use on our sites. So Wissington site actually today has a high efficiency combined heat and power unit which supplies power based on natural gas, admittedly, which provides all the power for the factory and indeed, as I'll come on to later, exports. So it's a self-contained unit, self-generating power, but actually the model as it sits there is pretty inefficient. And the reason why is this site produces 500,000 tonnes, actually did this year 515,000 tonnes of sugar, but also has about 500,000 tonnes of waste products. So the first thing we deal with is what do we do with the waste products? And that's where we add a number of additional legs. So the first thing that you think about when you bring sugar beet in is you've got topsoil, you've got soil with it. So we take that soil, we clarify it, we either ship it out into the landscape gardening sector or alternatively we make roll-on lawn topsoil out of it effectively, blended topsoil. So that's the first bit dealt with. It ceases to be a landfill cost, which it would otherwise be for us, and therefore there's a commercial incentive for us, but actually it also allows us to make a small revenue. Similarly with stones, they come in with sugar beet, we have to sort the stones from the beet. Stones don't diffuse terribly well, and so we then sell those out into the open market. So the Olympic site has, for example, got quite a lot of this year's stones as backfill. Animal feed then, we have pulp within sugar beet. Sugar beet is typically 75% water when received, and 25 of the remaining 25%, 75% is typically sugar, and the rest is either inorganic materials or pulp. So we blend some of the inorganics with the pulp and we create animal feed. That then goes back into the food chain. And then we have lime involved in the clarification process, which comes out as spent lime. We use that to go back in a return load, so no extra miles in terms of transport, onto the fields to help get the fields in the right shape for the next crop. So that's waste streams pretty much totally dealt with in this factory that's producing 500,000 tonnes of sugar. But that's not enough because that model still isn't cost efficient enough in the world to produce sugar. So we go to the next stream. Some of you may have seen the One Show or Country File in the last 12 months. Part of this has featured on both those programs. And that's because now, rather than dealing with byproducts, we're actually dealing with products that can generate us revenues. So we take, for example, the inorganic stream that is the residue in the beet, and we purify that through industrial scale chromatography and take out a betaine byproduct, which then goes either into fish feed or the pharmaceutical industry. On this site also, we put the UK's first bioethanol site, so 70 million litres of bioethanol from a beet juice. It was a low-quality juice, bypassing sugar manufacture into bioethanol to make bioethanol for your vehicles at home, and typically you will have that in your fuel today, even if you don't know about it. Raffinate and vinasse are some of the other organic compounds that come out of this process, relatively small scale, but again, collected and shipped out into differing applications. On the back of our bioethanol plant now, because we produce CO2 or have spare CO2 coming out of that site, we now liquefy that CO2, and that goes back to the bottling industry that also buys our sugar. I said we produced electricity on the extreme right for you. We do about 700 megawatts a year, 700,000 megawatt hours goes back into the grid. So a huge export of power from that high efficiency combined heat and power generation station that we've got at Wissington. And then to cap it all, in the process, the flow that you see, we have waste heat, we have CO2 that in sufficient volumes to actually feed a glass house to then produce tomatoes. It's the sexiest bit of Wissington that everybody tells me about, forget about the sugar, but actually it's really quite innovative. It means we make all types of tomatoes. They go into the UK market. It means the UK market has less imports, typically from Spain, and generates clearly a significant revenue for us. And we started that glass house at 5 hectares. It's now 18.5 hectares, and it's perfectly balanced with the waste heat and CO2 that we have from the site. So I talked earlier about this being the gold standard for a sugar plant. I think it is, but it is because of those add-ons, and it is because that's what makes it special, and that's what allows us today to be one of the most efficient sugar beet producers in the world, not even accommodating for different geographies. You know, top in the league table, we are very, very near the top for this reason. But the important point behind this is there's a significant amount of investment behind it. So the commercial environment's got to be right to do that investment. And if you think it's all about sugar beet, it isn't. This is a similar model for our factories in sugar cane in sub-Saharan Africa. Basically, these facilities take in sugar cane through a similar process, take out sugar in the form of a juice. Because there is a fibre that's left behind in cane which can't go to animal feed with a sufficiently high calorific value, we take that into the boiler plant, and these plants typically are self-sufficient. And in fact, our better plants now are exporting to rural communities. We've just upgraded our mill in both Zambia and Swaziland, and we're now significant exporters into communities that would otherwise have huge power outages. So again, they're just sort of building on that model. Not totally self-sufficient in Africa yet, but circa 90% self-sufficient. Our target is to be 100% self-sufficient in Africa and exporting. And in the UK, we're trying to find the equivalent of bagasse for beet, which I suspect will be anaerobic digestion of beet pulp in some way. So that's the model. There are a few other examples. If you think about moving from the model to driving efficiency in our operation, because the first was all about what the kit we've got, this is about how we use it. You can see that we have a pretty good track record of driving energy improvement. Energy is always, for me, an escalating cost, so again, very much commercially driven. How do I use less and less over time? Now, 25% in, 20 years, some will say that's not particularly dramatic, and I would be inclined to agree with you, but it continues to be pretty much straight line. And the beauty of the improvements that we've seen over the past in the UK is that we can take those same models and accelerate that same level of improvement into other regions of the world, and that's exactly what we do. Carbon footprints, second area that really does worry us, linked clearly to the first one. And we've been very proactive with the Carbon Trust and looked at, how do we actually take the footprint for our products, and we've got a number which has been audited and verified. Interestingly, about 38% of that number doesn't come from the manufacturing process at all, it comes from agriculture. And so what we're very focused on is how do we actually drive carbon improvements in agriculture, and that's a huge debate which I'm not equipped to deal with at this stage, but certainly it's something we're trying to understand fully as we look forward. Target for a 10% reduction by 2020. And then improvements in the supply chain. The chart on the right-hand side, which isn't overly clear, is the yield improvement per hectare that we've had in sugar since, I think this was 1980. And significant and straight line improvements in yield. So the fact that areas have been consolidated, and in fact, we are sort of thinking about how we sort of use sugar beet for other product applications, the reality is the yield improvement year on year has actually allowed a reduction in the total land assigned to this crop rather than the alternative. And then co-product developments, as I say, we had the UK's first bioethanol plant, 70 million litres, 70% greenhouse gas saving over the fossil fuel equivalent, and for renewable bioethanol, that's as good as it gets. Some will quote slightly higher figures for cane bioethanol coming out of Brazil. They're true. They're probably nearer 80% than 70%. But actually with CO2 capture, we think we're probably amongst, or just somewhere near the same level. So again, a really important metric for us. So there's some improvement stuff there. Then into our African operations, just to give you a few examples from there. Bagasse, as I've said, is used in the boilers. So we have boilers, in significant boiler investment actually, to make sure that we can not only supply what we need for our factories, but also supply the local communities. And that's effectively sort of giving back, which we like to do, but also raising the quality of life for pretty impoverished communities. Supplementing that bagasse with trash. So trash is the leaves that we take off the cane before we then process the cane through the factory. That has a calorific value, quite difficult to collect, but can be done. So we're looking at how we take that through to, again, through to our boiler plants and actually generate power, again, for the communities. 89%, I said 90% earlier of the energy requirements are now from our own renewable sources. We have a little bit of coal at the extremes of the seasons that we process the product for. We don't like that. We'll have to store bagasse to find a way around that, but we're absolutely intent on doing so. And then we have the same focus on co-products and byproducts. So we have ethanol production, potable ethanol production. So that's not the kind you put in your tank, it's the kind you put in your personal tank in the form of alcohol. But nevertheless, all our plants increasingly are going to have those kind of facilities. Again, what do they do for us? They add value, they improve the sustainability of the business model we've got, but they also supply a local need. And then lactulose and furfural. Lactulose is a specific product that comes out of South Africa, and furfural is actually another organic compound that comes out of sugarcane. Again, small volumes, but rather than wastes, these are now opportunities to improve revenue. And then finally, on social investment, our Africa business talks about being there at the maternity wards when our employees start families, right to the funeral services that we provide at the end, and just about everything in between. And that's true of our facilities in Africa. Something we're very, very proud of, and therefore, something that we continue to nurture, despite at times wondering whether the cost is actually worth it. Forget it, that's what we do, and that makes our model sustainable. And for example, in our hospitals in Africa, we have 7 doctors, 60 nurses, running pretty much 24/7 in all the regions we operate. And then we have 27 schools. Not only our employees' families going to those schools, but all the local communities again. And again, that's for us to keep the level of education up to maintain the sustainability of our business. And then I have one final slide. This is actually a slide which comes out of trade regulation change in the EU in about 2004-05, actually implemented in 2006. And the arrangement was that the EU would go from being a structural exporter of sugar to a structural importer of sugar, and those imports coming from the least developed countries around the world and what were previously called the Afro-Caribbean countries who had preferential access rights into Europe. Those were consolidated together, and it was decided that the EU should therefore allow access into a sugar market, which at the time was hugely remunerative, to those impoverished regions. Specifically for Swaziland, that also was accompanied by funding from the European Commission to help them develop the sugar industry in the region. That funding came through to government, and that was then linked with a smallholder. These are small grower developments who got direct funding from that pot of money to then develop their fields to produce sugar cane for us. We went into a 15-year deal with those small growers so that they were sure that they could get revenue for a long time, in return for providing the cane to our factories. For me, that's a clear example of sustainable development where funding goes in and we build an industry or develop an industry around it which can stand the test of time. Not only did we sign those contracts, but we also expanded the plant at the same time through our own commercial funding, and the consequence of that was we were able to provide power again for irrigation into those smallholder fields, so that again they were getting this sort of synergistic opportunity coming out of what was just essentially at the start a bung of cash from Europe. So I think it's a really neat model. It's a model I always go and see when I go to Africa because it's very real and very positive in terms of how it's changing communities for the better. Interestingly, I cite this one as well because when you think about sustainability, sometimes you think about it as one-dimensional, and I think some of the debate we had earlier actually says all these things are quite complex links, and we need to get it all right, not just part of it right. Had we got this one wrong, then clearly the whole picture would be different. For example, if the trade regulation had not worked in the way it was expected, at least in the short term, which it did, then this would never have got off the ground. I think that's all I was going to say. Thank you.